Can I just get you to touch on another form of arbitrage? For a long time, both of you have referred to the population Ponzi and the exceptionally heavy immigration Australia's been running since about the mid-2000s. We've been through a lot of finger-pointing and accusations of racism, but the idea of questioning the volume of immigration is starting to generate public concern, and as Dave has pointed out, it's been a significant factor in the rise of Hansonism, and it's also starting to see both sides of politics sort of back away from overt support for very high levels of immigration. Are you guys starting to sense a sea change in public understanding of the role of immigration in the economy?
Yeah, look, I think there is starting to be a lot more pressure about it, and it comes down to a simple reason. Folks aren't enjoying pay rises. Those of us living in the major cities like Sydney and Melbourne are being crushed loaded from population growth that's quite frankly insane. And just to put some figures to that, the Australian Bureau of Statistics a few weeks ago released its annual population data for the capital cities. And it showed that Melbourne's population grew by 108,000 in the 2016 financial year, which is the highest growth for a single city in Australia's history in 1 year. So it's 108,000. And also showed that Sydney's population grew by 83,000 in 1 year, which is also incredibly high. And those two cities, Melbourne and Sydney, have grown by 1 million and 820,000 respectively in the past 12 years, which is the equivalent of adding 27% to Melbourne's population and 20% to Sydney's population over that 12-year period. Now, if you're going to add roughly an MCG worth of people to large cities' populations every year, you're going to create indigestion. And that's exactly what we've had in both cities. We've got the road systems are becoming incredibly congested. Public transport's been crush loaded. There's been inadequate investment. And the crazy thing is the plan is to continue this high growth for decades into the future. So the state government's own forecasts in Sydney are projecting population growth of 87,000 people per year for the next 20 years. And if that actually comes to fruition, Sydney's going to add the equivalent of 4.5 Canberras to its population in just 20 years. Melbourne's even worse. The state government of Victoria is projecting 97,000 people per year for the next 35 years. That's 3.4 million people to be jammed into Melbourne in 35 years, which is equivalent to 9 Canberras or 2.5 Adelaides. Now, again, you don't have to be a rocket scientist to know that this is going to create massive problems for housing affordability, for congestion, and for overall livability. And I think the voters are finally cottoning onto this, and so is the media. And people are becoming unhappy because it's taken longer to drive from A to B. They can't get a seat in the train. Their kids can't afford a house. All the basic stuff that determines one's quality of life. So it's only a matter of time, in my view, until the immigration intake is cut, and it needs to be cut. The long run average between Federation and 2003, before John Howard ramped up the immigration intake, was 70,000 a year net overseas migration. And for the last decade, it's been running around 210,000. So they've basically tripled the migrant intake over the past 10 to 12 years. And it's just totally unsustainable.
Even beyond Sydney and Melbourne, regional cities are also experiencing very strong population growth. Tim Colbatch recently had a piece in the Melbourne Age exploring the absolutely staggering numbers of people moving to Geelong and Ballarat and Bendigo in Victoria. And at the same time, you've got politicians like Barnaby Joyce glibly proposing that those who can't afford a place in Sydney, well, they should get on their bikes and move to Tamworth. But the thing I keep coming back to is, are the jobs there to better support housing purchases? And are those jobs any more economically competitive than anywhere else in Australia? Or is he just talking about moving people on and out of sight?
Well, it's even more than that. I mean, that's a fair point. I mean, the unemployment rate in Tamworth is 7.1% currently, so it's well above the national average. But what Barnaby Joyce has effectively said to young Australians is that you have to make way so that we can import tens of thousands of people from overseas into the major capitals every year. So we're going to keep importing these people in, and therefore you have to make way for these new residents. To me, that's disgusting. The government's number one role should be to look after its incumbent residents, its own voters. And yet the federal government seems to be running the opposite policy, whereby it expects young people to move away from where they grew up, where their parents are, where their connections are, simply to make way for tens of thousands of new residents every year through mass immigration. It makes no sense.
Barnaby's also been at the forefront of another ad hoc response to a political imperative, that of moving Commonwealth public service jobs to regional locations. Look, I'd be the last to argue in favour of Canberra, but I'd note that both sides of politics are now proposing moving Commonwealth public services to various regional electorates, and would see that as leading to yet more woeful policy outcomes unless it was really well coordinated.
Yeah, look, totally. I mean, the crazy thing is the government seem to think you can decentralise by moving people into these regional areas and then have them commute back into the major cities for jobs. So we get all these ridiculous notions like, oh, we'll build some fast speed train so that we can shift people to, Albury and they can get to Melbourne in an hour and a half to work in Melbourne. I mean, that's just crazy. All you're doing is replacing urban sprawl with dormitory cities. It's no different. I mean, what's the difference between tacking on a suburb at the end of Melbourne or moving people 200 kilometres away to a regional centre? It's the same. It's still sprawl and it's still incredibly inefficient. I mean, if you want to decentralise, that's great, but we need some industry out there, and there's no plan to create industry out in these places.
To go back to what Dave was saying earlier, there's no plan to be productive.
Yeah, that's right. None of these places will earn us export revenue, and this here is again the problem with the mass immigration program. We've got most of the new migrants moving to Sydney and Melbourne, and they don't export anything. They're working in services jobs that don't earn any export income. Australia would simply improve its trade balance if it stopped immigration, because we get most of our exports from our regional areas, like the mining areas, the agricultural areas. The only stuff we actually export from the capital cities is a small amount of services and a small amount of manufacturing. And if you keep crush loading the major cities with more and more population every year, you're not going to boost your exports very much. But you're going to massively increase your imports as all these migrants buy flat screen TVs, imported cars, imported furniture, etc. It's just nuts. It's not about boosting productivity. It's not about boosting competitiveness. It's all about just maintaining the pressure on demand, creating bigger markets and increasing households. That's what an immigration program is about. It's not about boosting productivity and boosting the living standards of the incumbent population, which is what it should be about. I wouldn't care if we ran a mass immigration program if it spread the population and it had a plan attached to it. If it was about we're going to build new cities with new industries and make Australia more productive and essentially become like Germany, where it has a whole bunch of towns spread out throughout the country which actually produce stuff. But Australia's approach is simply to funnel them all into Sydney and Melbourne to prop up housing and consumption. It makes no sense.
It does make sense if you're a fucking bubbler.
Yeah, well, of course, it does make sense if you're one of the rent-seeking growth lobby elites who actually makes the money from it. So if you're a bank, great, more people to sell mortgages to. If you're a retailer like Jerry Harvey, awesome, more people to sell imported flat-screen TVs to. If you're a property developer, awesome, pushes up land prices, you can sell more homes, etc. But for the average Joe, it makes zero sense. It makes our living standards worse. We're getting crush loaded. We're paying more for housing. And for the economy as a whole, it makes us worse off because, again...
And it forces your wage down.
That's right, yes. It forces your wage down. But for the economy as a whole, it makes us all worse off because we're not going to export really anymore. We're going to import a hell of a lot more and have more debt because, again, these people aren't working in export industries. They're working in services industries. They're working in cafes. They're working in massage places. They're working in all these other services, things that are tied to places like Melbourne, which, again, don't produce any export income. But everyone who comes here buys a hell of a lot of imports. And it blows out the trade balance. It blows out the current account deficit. And it blows out household debt. And ultimately, it makes us worse off. Because I've often said that Australia pays its way in the world by selling off a fixed endowment of resources. That's primarily how we pay off. We pay our way in the world, and it's our exports that pay for our imports. Problem with it is the more people you have, the quicker you have to sell off your fixed resources to maintain a constant standard of living. You're effectively, through, population quantitative easing, devaluing your resource stock because you're spreading it across more people.
That's exactly what
it makes absolutely no sense. Yeah. But yet, this is the plan, to go to 40 million mid-century, to go to 70 million by the end of the century, probably 100 million after that. It's just growth madness. It makes no sense.
You're racist, mate. That's your problem. That's a brilliant line, Leith, about people
population quantitative easing.
Yeah, it is. It's a very good line.
That's great.